Welcome back to Air Quality Matters. We already have the tools and knowledge we need to make a difference to the quality of the air we breathe in our built environment. The conversations we have and how we share what we know is the key to our success. I'm Simon Jones, and coming up, a conversation with Aayush Jha, co-founder and CEO of Clairco, a clean air as a service company. One of the fascinating things about as a service models is the laser focus it requires across the business on delivering what matters. It requires outcomes to be stitched into the very DNA of the business and drives incredibly deep relationships with customers as a result. History has taught us that in business and more broadly, there is a lot to learn from companies that take this route. So I was fascinated to talk to Aayush about clean air as a service, how they measure success, manage risk, and construct a business to deliver clean air at scale in environments like India and the Middle East. Now, the sound's not great on this episode, and that's on me, I'm afraid. I didn't pick it up during the conversation. So I promised to sit down with Aayush again when I'm in India in the summer to chat with him more. Even so, there's some fascinating insights here on this one, and I think well worth sticking with it. So don't forget to check out the sponsors in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. This is a conversation with Aayush Jha. I mean, genuinely, Aayush, I think what's really interesting about air quality as a service is what makes any as a service model interesting. And that is both in how you define the value proposition to customers, because it's a different proposition, isn't it, to selling equipment? But it's also a very different proposition as a business, delivering on a promise as an as a service model compared to delivering as a promise on a piece of equipment. And I thought that would be the interesting thing to talk about from an air quality perspective, because we haven't really had that conversation. So from your perspective, like, do you think there's some broad lessons that you've learned and the industry can learn from the practicalities of delivering air quality as a service?
Absolutely, Simon. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. And this is something which is very close to us, and we've been working on it for the last 7, 8 years now. So if I just focus on why are we looking and why are we doing anything around clean air as a service? Why are we even thinking about it? Why are we not just selling the hardware? Why are we not selling the air quality monitors and the air filters? The basic difference between us and most of the companies that we've seen out there is that we are not trying to sell a hardware. We are promising an indoor air quality limit. So, irrespective of what happens in the building, in general uses, we'll ensure that the indoor air quality is 90% better than the outdoor air quality. How we do that is also very interesting. But before I answer that, what's important to understand, Simon, is that each building is different in nature. Each building will have different characteristics. Some buildings will have a higher positive pressure in a building. Some buildings will not have a perfect HVAC system. Some buildings will have ventilation systems that were designed for something else but are not really performing that well. They are subpar compared to when they were designed for it, right? So there are multiple issues that go in a building. So just by selling a product which is a plug and play, it will not truly honestly solve the problem in all the buildings. So almost 95% of the buildings that we go to, say after 5 years, 6 years of that building being launched and it's already occupied, it doesn't necessarily work as it was designed to work. You have certain problems. So this is something that we've seen in India and also in UAE. We are operational in Dubai as well. The buildings were designed for say a LEED platinum or LEED gold, but genuinely after 5, 7 years, we see that they're not performing to that level. That's why it's telling air filter or anything else will not solve the entire problem. What we need to do is need to genuinely understand that building and then figure out what all needs to do, what all needs to be done. Sorry. And it's very important, Simon, that we understand the basics of air quality management. The basics of air quality management, I believe, something that is more important than just the air filter, which we are installing in the air conditioners or the HVAC, is the maintenance of positive pressure in the building. That is extremely important. According to ASHRAE guidebook, we need to maintain at least 2 to 4 Pascal of positive pressure in the building at all times. You might also be aware, Simon, that if we pump in too much air in a building, the amount of energy it will consume to cool that amount of air or heat that amount of air will be exponential compared to using the same stale air again and again, because maintaining that temperature will be far easier. So hence, we need to understand what amount of fresh air are we taking, what kind of filtration are we doing, and where all we need to do the monitoring properly. And the entire consulting approach to this is very difficult when we're trying to do a hardware sell. That's why clean air as a service stitches all these three things perfectly, and we are able to design these things as per the client's requirement in that building. And extremely important to our clean air as a service is the promise. And in fact, that is our tagline as well, Simon, that we guarantee indoor air quality. In most buildings, we promise that your air quality will be 90% better than outdoor air quality across the year. In some buildings which are already functioning better, we can guarantee them WHO level of air quality as well, or well building guidelines of air quality as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there's a couple of really interesting points for me there. One is this fundamental difference of having to stand over an outcome rather than the potential of an outcome. Because often when we're selling products into the built environment, it comes in different parts. There's the promise of the performance from a design, so a consulting engineer or a real estate developer or whoever's involved in the delivery of that building, there's the promise of the outcome, the theoretical performance of that space. And then the equipment manufacturers will provide equipment that offers a promise of performance based on the design. And then usually there's some loose promise of performance wrapped up in defect warranties and, liabilities of the building in the short term. But very quickly, all of that evaporates away. And immediately then it kind of finds itself in the operational side of the business, where the maintenance teams then usually have very standardized ways of just keeping buildings running. And depending on the quality of the building, often that's almost a run to failure type scenario where stuff just gets fixed if it's broken, and I complain about this a lot on this podcast for those that listen to me, is that we tend to run to failure ventilation and HVAC we do service air conditioning units because there's an obligation to, but beyond that, very rarely do you see people going around measuring airflows and measuring performance of ventilation systems. But an as a service model is fundamentally different. It almost doesn't care about any of that stuff beforehand. What counts is contractually, are you delivering on a promise? Are you delivering on an outcome? And your job is to tie all of that stuff together in order to deliver that. And that's it. It seems like a subtle difference, but it's actually a fundamentally different one, because there's no excuses.
Absolutely.
You live and die on the promise of the performance, don't you?
Absolutely.
And it doesn't matter if you're struggling to get filters from the supply chain or not. That's not the client's problem. Your KPI is the delivery of that performance of the system. And the other interesting thing you mentioned there was the fact that we can view this through different lenses. You can view the promise of performance of a differentiation from what's outside, this 90% better than outside model, or a threshold. You can say, look, there's a standard that we can target and we can promise to meet that standard. But either way, it's a very defined KPI, and you're held accountable, I guess.
Absolutely, Simon. And accountability is at heart of Clairco. In fact, when we were starting the company in 2018, we were very clear what are the issues that we see in indoor air quality management. The biggest problem that we saw is that people don't understand the air quality in real time because we can't feel it that quickly. That's why we need IoT-based air quality monitor. And that's where we started manufacturing air quality monitors. It measures all your particulate matter 2.5, particulate matter 10, carbon dioxide, PVOC, carbon monoxide. If you need SOx, NOx, and you name it, we have around 14 possible sensors that we can install, and we can have it in a single box as well if required. Right? That was very important to understand genuinely what the air quality is in real time. And then second part was to have accountability to it. For example, some of the larger air filter OEMs, their aim is to sell that air filter to the building. Um, it is impossible for them to predict exactly when do they need to change the air filter. There's a possibility that the air filter was installed in New Delhi where the air quality is horrible. And if the same air filter is installed, say probably where you are, where particulate matter is probably in single digits, the OEM will push or notify you to change the filter at the end of the year, right? Or the agent, sales agent, or whoever it is. But then that is not really, backed by any sort of data. It is a very broad assumption that it's been a year, you should replace your air filter. But then again, Simon, if you think of it, we are either wasting the filter, which could have, run for another year in Ireland, or either changing the filter in Delhi too late. Either of the two scenarios are happening with the same air filter, same model, same number of runners, everything same. But the dust holding capacity of the air filter is similar, is fixed. But the dust which is there in the New Delhi air filter would probably be 20, 30x of what you have in Ireland. So hence, there are so many moving parts to it. It's important to have it as a serve. And what we realize that if we have different OEMs selling different hardware, it's always easy and confusing to understand accountability. Where this is where we were very clear that we will always be a company that is accountable for what we provide for, and hence outcome as a service was extremely important to us. So, like I
Yeah.
mentioned earlier, like
And let's break that down.
sure, please go ahead.
Yes. I sorry, I think we had a slight interruption in the service there. I think what's fascinating here is to break this down a little bit, so to truly understand what it means to deliver air quality as a service. And from what I understand of as a service models, there are some things that have to stack up in
Yeah,
order for this to work.
right,
And fundamentally, because at the heart of it is this accountability thing. You are taking a risk. You are being held accountable for an outcome. So normally there has to either be scale or profitability or clearly defined outcomes, something that's measurable in order to be able to make this work. So I'm assuming it's no different for you. There's some fundamentals here that have to be in play for this to be a model that works financially both for you as a company and for a client. And from our discussion, the first thing is scale. Is that at the moment you're
certainly.
delivering this to fairly large buildings, I would say. Is
Right.
that it? So you need a certain scale in order for this to be an effective model for a customer.
Simon, the smallest building that we will work with is at least 100,000 square feet.
Okay.
Anything below that is not that interesting. But we've worked with a few companies which have a chain of multiple buildings across the country, which are around 50, 60,000 square feet. That's also comfortable for us, provided the entire client is around a million or bigger than that.
And what does that mean fundamentally? What's the importance of the scale? Is it the amount of equipment and infrastructure and capital spend that you're putting in? Is it the volume of air and the value? You effectively defining a value per cubic meter of air that you have that makes this worthwhile.
Absolutely.
There's some metric, I guess, somewhere behind all of this that says at a certain point this becomes workable.
Absolutely, Simon. There are two important things here we need to understand. First is a relatively larger building. In our experience, what we've seen in India are designed in a better way. There's a little more intelligence that goes into it because these buildings usually go for some level of USGBC certification, some LEED certification, etc. So 100,000 to 200,000 square feet building we've seen usually have come with these certifications. So when you have certain certifications, there's a class of a building that you're trying to understand and target. This building would have a treated fresh air system, will have some sort of ventilation system that will work, will have some levels of air handling unit which can sustain a particular static pressure. When you increase the filtration level, you are basically increasing the hindrance to airflow or the differential pressure in the air handling unit. Hence, these things are important. That's where size of a building helps you reach out to those clients where you already have these basics figured out.
That's
Secondly,
really interesting. Yeah.
yeah, Simon, the second point that you touched upon is also very, very important for us. It's important to have a scale in the size because we're always taking some amount of debt from the market while launching it at a client. Say, for example, a 200,000 square feet building. We'll take some debt from our partners, some credit, and work on that. And we'll break even in say 2 years, 2.5 years or so. What's important is that on day one, most of the cost is borne by us. So the IoT devices we're talking about. So what are the IoT devices? We have the air quality monitor, then we have the differential pressure transmitter, and we have a smart switch that controls the treated fresh air systems. How much fresh air are we bringing in, right? And now we've also started adding people counters at entry and exit. These IoT sensors help us understand the number of people in a space. They help us understand the carbon dioxide levels or other gases level in real time. And because we're controlling both the air handling units and the treated fresh air system, there's a lot of data that we need to generate. And hence, we need to have this IoT. Along with this, we are talking about multiple different air filters that we'll have to add in the air conditioning system. That also comes at a particular cost, at a particular price. Hence, we need that debt. So these are the two things that are very important. Minimum size from a financial capability standpoint, and secondly, minimum size so that these companies or these buildings should have some certifications because we don't want to start from scratch. We want to start from a building which is having at least bare bones ready and is working at a certain level at least.
That's really interesting, and I wonder if those two lines differ. The scale from a financial perspective, the fundamentals of making it work, and the scale from a quality perspective, that you've noticed that below a certain size, we start to lose some of the quality assurance that you might get with some of the bigger buildings, with some of the standards that they might have needed to achieve. And perhaps there's a lesson in there to real estate that, by limiting the quality of HVAC and ventilation systems in buildings because of scale and size, you limit the potential of opportunities like this down the road because the building just isn't capable of adopting advanced ventilation and HVAC practices because you've decided at your 20,000 square foot building that it's not worth putting anything fancy in, and all of a sudden you're limiting potential down the road. That's an interesting observation, that actually, that it's not just a scale of delivery of clean air, it's actually below a certain scale we see the quality of the HVAC drop off, or the quality assurance drop off that it makes it difficult for us to stitch in these solutions.
Absolutely, Simon, because it's important to understand how old is the building. The older the building, it might have more leakages. It might have lesser or zero positive pressure. There's a possibility that the building might have no fresh air systems, or might have fresh air systems that worked 10 years back, don't work anymore. So we've seen all these buildings here and there. Also, what we've noticed is that there are some developers who have spent more time and effort and genuine mind space in maintaining better indoor air quality or indoor environment quality. It's easier to work in those buildings compared to some of the other developers where we continue to struggle with basics.
Yeah. And I thought of something else there. What was it? The yeah, I'm guessing also there's a, because this is relatively new, you also need confidence on your side that you're going to be able to deliver this. So perhaps with time, you might start stretching out into some of those edge cases. But at the moment, you want fairly safe bets from an as a service model. You don't want to be taking undue risk in these complex financial models. So I guess there's a little bit of that. Have you found practically through your assessments, there are buildings you're having to walk away from because of age or quality of HVAC install and say, look, sorry, we'd love to, but this building's just not in a place where we can help you?
Absolutely, Simon. Unfortunately, over a quarter of the buildings we visit, we cannot launch there, and our clients are these larger, larger global companies that have presence in India, and usually they have decent buildings, but still, in the building there are certain things that need to be sought out. For example, I'll take a random example. Let's and take an example of someone, say like a Visa, fairly large company, working out of a very good facility. Um, and the problem is the occupier or the tenant can only do say 5 out of 10 things. The rest of the out of 10 things now need to be done by the developer, or we need approvals from the developer. So it adds to the structural problem as well. That's why a client which had a larger building or had a larger chunk of the building will be able to move things faster. If it's a single tenant building, imagine a very large, say, a 500,000 square feet building where you only have one tenant. Um, Managing that building will be far easier from a permission standpoint.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And like, so that must be quite a shock, I imagine, to people that are engaging with you to be told. I mean, it must be quite a shot across their bow to be engaging with
Yes.
a very proactive company, and for you to turn around and say, look, I'd love to work with you, but for these reasons, we just can't help you. Uh,
Right.
how do those conversations go? Like when you're saying,
Yes.
look, if you can get these things in place, like is some of the stuff fixable? Are you able to say to people, look, come back to us if you can get the building to here, or are most of those quarter just write-offs? There's no chance that building is certainly for the short term is going to be in a position where you can help them.
Simon, almost all the things that we see which don't work with us are it's just possible to fix them. It's a human problem rather than a mechanical or a building physical level problem. It's a human problem. There'll always be a struggle between the developer and the tenant, like who pays for what, uh, and that takes a lot of time for these guys to come on the same page and start working towards it. So that's one of the bigger problems. Um, but and say for example, if we work at a building which is owned by a building, owned by a company that also occupies the entire space, usually launching there is super quick because we don't need permission, we don't need to speak to different OEMs that are doing AMCs, etc. Everything just falls in the line in based on those scales. So that's a human problem rather than a building issue.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that actually. And that, that's right at the heart of what we call this split incentive problem, isn't it? Of owner occupier and or tenant landlord situations. Yeah, I mean, you can
Yeah.
have big buildings that have quite a complex split incentive structure with even different leaseholds within the same building, so um, different arrangements with the landlord depending on how long a tenant has been there. So you've got to unpack all of that and make that work.
I'd
So
like to
often it's
highlight
that.
something here. Yeah. I'd like to
Yeah.
highlight something here, Simon, because when I say clean air as a service, it's a two-way service level agreement. I promise that I'll deliver on these things. But the client has to promise that they will use their air conditioning under these particular guidelines that we highlight. That they have to do X, Y, and Z as well. Unless and until they are not delivering on their part of the promise, it's impossible to maintain air quality. I'll take an interesting example, and it's also going to sound a little lame, but this is something that genuinely happens fairly often, Simon. In New Delhi, the temperatures in winters are often single digit in centigrade, right? It's fairly cold. So there is no need for the cooling system to work. In India, the number of buildings that can heat a space are fairly low. I think at max it will be at 1%. Should be lower than 1% in my view, right? Because primarily we need to cool buildings. We don't need to warm buildings at any time. So in winter, most of the larger buildings do not use air conditioning almost at all, or might only use it for half an hour in a day. Because just by circulating that cold air, people start to shiver and they feel uncomfortable. There's no thermal comfort there. But if you think about it, unless and until the air passes through the air filter, which is installed in the air handling unit or in the HVAC, I will not be able to deliver on the air quality promise. Hence, I mentioned that it's a two-way promise. Unless and until they run the air conditioning based on our guidelines, uh, there is no service level agreement on that side. And thankfully, because we have a lot of IoT sensors, we have all the data. How many hours was the air conditioning system working? What was the temperature? What was the CO2 levels? What was the different air quality levels across the building? So we have to substantiate on that as well.
And I think what you say there touches on one of the key fundamentals as a service model, is that deep client relationship that you have to build with customers in an as a service model, because in almost all service models, the outcome is going to be so deeply tied to the use of that particular service. And we know this, we understand this fundamentally from things like jet engines. One of the first as a service models, it was about air miles, and the Rolls Royce and people that delivered those models would work very closely with pilots to teach them how to get the most out of the engines and to fly them sympathetically, because it was in everybody's interest from a fuel use perspective and also a longevity of the engine's perspective, critically important to getting good outcomes. Similarly, with military hardware, Apache helicopters and so on, all of these things have deep-rooted client user relationships with the as a service model provider, because it's in everybody's interest to get a good outcome. And I think that's at the heart of what's fascinating with air quality as a service, is you find yourself at the bleeding edge of those relationships, because it's the area that we've always struggled with the built environment, is things around air quality and thermal comfort and use of HVAC systems and heating systems and so on, is that you've got no choice. You have to get that right, because it's both a KPI in the satisfaction of the client,
Absolutely.
but a poorly educated client is going to, at the very least, water down the model profitability, and at worst, utterly destroy it. So I imagine that's something you have a laser focus on, particularly with this being quite new. is working very closely with people in buildings to get the outcomes they want, but also get the
Right.
outcomes you want as well.
Absolutely, Simon. So one of our clients, again, in the national capital in India, in Delhi, um, promised all their tenants that they will have pristine air quality, and they were charging a fair premium on their rentals to provide clean air. And and it was a fairly decent large building, if I'm not wrong, almost around 900,000 square feet building, grade A real estate, right? But the ventilation systems were ancient in a way, right? And because the client genuinely understood what our problems were, why would we not be able to promise them what they wanted? These guys realized and they spent some time and money to help us fix those basics, right? For example, the ingress of air when someone enters a building. How do you ensure? So we ensure that there are two glass doors instead of one when someone enters. And we had much stronger purification levels between those two glass doors that helped us reduce the ingress, the dust ingress, or the PM 2.5 ingress in that space, and the client was ready to invest in that, right? And these kind of successes can only happen when you have that pristine connection with the client, and the client is able to understand what needs to be done and is ready to walk the mile with you. Otherwise, these
Yeah.
stories are hard to come by.
And is your relationship primarily with the deliverer of the space, or are you finding yourself developing relationships with the users of the space as well, starting to provide them with better ways of using their spaces, information sheets? And so are you finding yourself having a relationship with the actual users of the space, or is it primarily with the building owners, as it were?
It's an equal split, Simon. I would say a lot of our clients are real estate developers who have a lot of grade A real estate, or some of them are occupiers themselves who have decent amount of commercial real estate and they want to maintain air quality for their employees' well-being. So it's a proper combination of it. But also in cases where we're working with the developers, these these developers usually like to market that they have clean air. So what we do is we put in these gigantic, 60, 70-inch TV screens at the entrance of a building where we showcase indoor and outdoor air quality deltas, which are usually around 90, 95%, 98%. So that is a very important sort of communication layer with the end user. Of course, we are not able to speak to most of the people who are occupying the building, but the client, the end client or the end tenant, gets to know about the air quality fairly often. And I'm certain that most of the data reports that we share with our clients, the client also shares that with their tenants.
Yeah, interesting. And what are the kind of buildings that you're finding yourself primarily going into? Is it mostly office space at this stage, or is it a whole a broader sector of real estate than just offices?
70% is office spaces, and within office spaces, 60% should be large offices, and 40% must be co-working, which will have a split here and there, which will have multiple properties in the city.
Okay.
For
And are
example,
you
for
going?
example, yeah, the biggest client that we have in India is WeWork. We manage all their sites in the country. They have roughly 35 offices in the country, and we manage air quality across pan India for that. Similarly, apart from office spaces, airports and malls are also increasingly becoming important because malls want to differentiate themselves in the mall in the next neighborhood. And airports, interestingly, are doing this to get all the certifications and win different awards so that they can increase their own rental yield eventually as well. It's all tied up with this.
And are you seeing any interest from the kind of medical sector? So, from hospitals and healthcare, that kind of thing. Although, 'cause traditionally they can be quite under-resourced sectors unless it's private healthcare, so that could be a challenge. And the other, and then also I was thinking kind of manufacturing, kind of pharmaceutical industries, process manufacturing, these kind of things where, again, clean air is quite a critical element of what they're doing.
Sure, sure, Simon. So, we do not focus in healthcare and pharma for the simple reason, number one, that uh, do you understand the concept of red ocean and blue ocean spaces? I'll quickly clarify. Imagine a space where you have too much competition, and that is a market where you call it as a red ocean. And similarly, the blue ocean strategy is focus in a space where you have relatively lesser other players, and you can carve out your own niche there and eventually build a large, strong business out of that. So we're really moving towards that, and we focus that we will, focus only towards office spaces and buildings which were relatively lesser served from air purification companies, large air filter companies, and we've seen decent growth there. But now is the time where we just started focusing some of our energies in the hospital space as well. Unfortunately, hospitals still don't have the kind of compliance that need them to maintain the air purification that they should ideally have. Apart from the operation theaters and the ICUs, etc., these critical areas, all the other parts of the hospital don't have any filtration. And hence, the hospital acquired infections are extremely high. And this is something that really needs to be taken care by these larger organizations that form compliances for hospitals. Unfortunately, in India, those compliances from a indoor air quality standpoint are still fairly archaic or weak, which needs to change.
Yeah, no, I understand. I don't think that's a uniquely Indian problem either. I think generally the healthcare sector suffers from that quite generally, which is interesting. And it's interesting what you say about focusing on the blue sky part
The
of
blue
the
ocean
the
space, yeah.
market, blue ocean. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, has there been any interest in residential settings, so some of the bigger real estate residential areas that may have centralized delivery of ventilation? I imagine that's quite rare, but perhaps in places like Dubai and other parts of the world might be more common. Is that something you've seen any interest in?
So in residential space, in the luxury apartment space, most buildings in India as well are centrally air conditioned now.
Okay.
And on an average, these luxury apartments in India are retailing at around $1 billion now. So so they have the budgets to spend on air purification. So we've launched a product called Refi Pure. This is probably the only air purification system that also brings in fresh air while cleaning the air. And the entire purification system sits outside the wall of the building. So it takes zero real estate and just has small vents, which is recirculating the air and also bringing in fresh air based on the air quality parameter. And it's the AI which decides how much fresh air to bring in, when to bring in, if people are sleeping, what is the sound decibel level that is acceptable, a slight humming sound or a little more. Can we increase the volume of air, etc., etc. There are multiple things that happens in a product called Recipure, which we launched earlier this year, and we're seeing decent interest in the luxury apartment space in India right now.
Yeah, interesting. And will that sit as a kind of an as a service model similar to what you're doing? Was that something completely? That's a kind of a purchased product
Yes,
more.
yes.
So
So
yeah,
what's
okay,
happening
fair
here
enough.
is, Simon, that we are selling to the developers directly, and developers will install each of these devices in each homes, and they SEP to the end client. We almost never speak to the end client here, apart from the mobile application that we have, which is a communication window with the end client. But we never have a financial transaction with them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can live in hope. The residential sector is so important for health and well-being outcomes long term that you could see as a service models providing some benefit there at some point, but it seems like quite a long way off at the moment. I mean, one of the other benchmarks that I suppose is critically important, particularly when you're setting these fundamental KPIs. The first one that springs to mind is this delta T or differential between inside and outside from an air quality perspective.
Right.
Um, so that's a fundamental KPI of yours, particularly in India. That you will look at average air quality, I guess, over the year or the seasons in a particular area, and work out what you think you can promise from a KPI perspective. Is that how it works? You say, look, based on the environmental conditions that this building sits in, this is our promise to you that it will always sit above this kind of level, or not on
Precisely, Simon.
average 90% of the time above this kind of level or something.
Precisely, Simon. And a lot of times, things also change when we're looking at hyperlocal pollutant levels. So what we've seen in some parts of the country, that particulate matter is a major pollutant in India, but there are certain spaces in some large cities where nitrogen oxides or sulfur-based oxides are also fairly high in those spaces. Because we measure everything, our KPIs can only be based on everything if our contract justifies for that. And the client is ready to modify their air conditioning systems or the HVAC to be able to take the kind of filtration that's required. Thankfully, all the hardware, all the air filters that we use are Clairco make. So it's easier to install all of them together, put them together, and have a unified system where we are sharing data and taking actionable insights out of. But the client needs to really understand that as well. Last but very, very important, Simon, is anything as a service should be a longer term contract. A 1 year contract is not interesting to us, Simon. I would rather sign a 5 or 7 year deal with a client because we are able to provide, of course, the best price to the end client, but also provide a better service because we understand the continuity of that particular space. Because when we take credit from banks, etc., the interest and the cost of the hardware, it just makes it very unviable for us to, have a 1 year.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that just shows that you also need to fundamentally understand the environment that building sits in. So if you're in Delhi, for example, some buildings may really come under pressure from a stubble burning particulate matter type PM at certain times of the year, whereas other buildings in other parts of India may struggle more with traffic based pollution and, like you say, the NOxes and the sulfur dioxides if they're industrial areas. So you really do take account of where the building is, and is that something you sit down then with the client in a consultative process and say, look, this is what we find about the building that you're in, this is what we think we could do, what are the kind of benchmarks that we want to measure against? Is that a kind of a consultative process with the client ultimately?
That is a very integral part of our client onboarding, Simon. The client really genuinely needs to understand the status quo. What's the air quality right now inside their building and outside of their building? You might remember in the call I explained that we also need to have an outdoor air quality monitor. It's extremely important so that we are able to understand the delta, right? Apart from that, apart from the outdoor conditions, I mean, something that we've not spoken enough, or we probably should spend more time on, is what are the other indoor pollutants, or what happens that generates these indoor pollutants. For example, the usage of certain air fresheners in the washrooms, right? The usage of some sort of a cleaning equipment or sprays that we do, the housekeeping does, that generates a lot of VOCs, formaldehyde, benzene, toluene, etc. Different kinds of organic gases, right? We sometimes have to sit with our clients, especially in the retail space, because a particular perfume or a fragrance is what so they have their brands which come up with the smell as well, right? It's just not the ambience. The smell is also an integral part of it. So that's also an important factor. At an airport and at a very, very large, a million square feet mall in India, in Bangalore, the client had to spend a lot of time in changing their fragrance, which is also approved by us, which does not generate VOCs. So these are relatively more herbal, more natural substances that they're using compared to the chemical ones they were using earlier.
I'll have you back to the podcast in just a minute, but I wanted to tell you briefly about InBiot, a partner of the podcast. I came across InBiot a while ago, and in fact, completely unrelated to the podcast, had been trying out some of their sensors here in my office, which I still have here today, and with customers. I was seriously impressed then and remain so. InBiot are a multidisciplinary team with a common goal to promote healthy and sustainable interior spaces. They manufacture smart indoor air quality monitors and an exceptional cloud platform. I get to see and use many products, as you could imagine, and InBiot stands out here. The quality of the product, the innovation they bring with sensors and connectivity options, and a platform with some unique approaches to reporting and integration with many of the reference standards in the sector like Reset, Well, Lead, and others. Their devices can also be integrated to any building to control and automate the operation of HVAC systems, ensuring optimal air quality and energy savings. Details are in the show notes as always, and at airqualitymatters.net and at InBiot. That's INBIOT.es. Now, back to the podcast. And we've talked a lot about the proposition, and I think we had to, because it's, like I say, it's quite unusual for a business to be as a service from an air quality perspective. So I think it's been really interesting to understand the value proposition here for clients. And I think fundamentally, if people are able to pin an improvement compared to outdoor conditions, or tie it to a particular standard, a well or a WHO, whatever is determined as achievable, I think that's great. I think people can instinctively get why that has value. What is it? I think for listeners to understand, like typically for a client that works with you, what are the component parts of this for them? You've mentioned air quality monitors and dashboards and data. You've also mentioned filters and HVAC equipment. Like ultimately, when you're going into I hate to say typical building, because I imagine in your world anything's but typical. But like, what is the physical part to this? When you're delivering an as a service model, part of that is the deployment of more advanced products or additional products to reach a goal. What's that look like for people? What are they typically getting?
So Simon, here we're talking about 6 different parts. Okay. First is the air quality monitors, like you mentioned. Second are the differential pressure transmitter. These are the sensors that we install in the HVAC systems next to the air filters. This helps us understand the loading on the air filter. How dirty is the air filter? And because we are ourselves a manufacturer of the air filter, we understand our DHC, or the dust holding capacity, and we can predict when the filter needs to be changed. Because a dirty air filter will not only increase the amount of mold or might actually pollute the space, but will also significantly increase the energy consumption of that HVAC system, right? So it's very important to understand the real-time dust holding capacity of that air filter. So this is the second IoT part. The third IoT part is the control on the treated fresh air system. Amount of fresh air coming into the building is tricky. If we bring in too much fresh air, that building will start consuming substantial energy to just maintain the temperature, to maintain thermal comfort. If we don't bring in fresh air, from an air quality standpoint, it's a problem, right? So it's a fine line that we have to walk through, and hence controlling the treated fresh air is extremely important. The fourth part is, of course, the air filters. These air filters can be from a HEPA level to a MERV 13, MERV 14, or a NERV 8, whatever level filters which we can possibly install in these spaces. And these filters are installed in the treated fresh air system and the air handling units as well. The fifth, extremely important, is the third player in this entire contract. It's the financial institution that is coming in and giving us the loan for that particular contract. Sixth, probably again extremely tricky, very important, is the understanding that a client or the facility manager needs to have of what all things they need to do. What is their KPI? right? This is something that we've touched upon before. Explaining and educating the client here is extremely important. So this is the sixth and very, very important part of all.
So there's a kind of there's the data part of this, the IoT, the data acquisition, the understanding the performance. There's the physical componentry part of it, which sounds like predominantly it's filters for you. And then the third part of this is the kind of the financial and client side of this, that the making this work, because without that, I mean, it's a fundamental building block. You've got to have the money, and you've got to have a client that understands their goals as well, what their outcomes are. From a data part then, so from the data acquisition part, you deploy sensors into the space, because typically I'm guessing they don't have the sensors or the quantity of them at the very least that you need to fully understand that space. Are these sensors and hardware that you're making and selling yourself to clients? I mean, not selling, maybe
Yes,
coming as part of air quality as a service, but
right.
these are your own products?
Yes, yes. Each and every SKU that I talk about or that we have is manufactured by us, and it's the quality control is extremely important. If the device is not calibrated right, we will lose on essential energy saving points, or it might result in bad air quality. For example, a badly calibrated air quality monitor can give us wrong data, and all our algorithms, all our artificial intelligence and the machine learning algorithms that we have multiple patents on these algorithms that I talk about. All of these will show or give you wrong analysis, and hence
Yeah,
it will screw it
junk
up,
in,
right?
junk out. It's the classic, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah, bad data in, bad outcomes out the other side, for sure. And I guess ultimately, because you're delivering an outcome here, you equally don't want somebody coming along as a third party and saying, actually, this KPI is being missold. These sensors are saying the wrong thing. So there's two parts to this. One, you need confidence in the data you're working with for the machinery of the algorithms, junk in, junk out. But equally, you need to protect yourself, that if there's third party independent assessment of a space, that it
Yeah.
aligns as much as it's going to with low cost sensors. I mean, I appreciate there's always a limit with what you can do with the deployment at scale of low cost sensors, but so that's really, and again, and I keep harking back to this point. That's the fundamental difference with an as a service model, is that every part of this has to stack up. Like,
Right.
none of this works if all of it doesn't work. Right. And we've understood this really well from Boeing and Rolls-Royce and Apache and all of these people that have developed as a service models over the years. Is what an as a service model is, it demands every gear in the organization to do its part. Not only the components, but even the delivery and servicing of those components, and the lifespan of those. Everything has to function and be understood, because if it isn't, ultimately, it doesn't matter. Like, it's the outcome that you're being measured on. So I think that's fascinating. So from an
And
air
that's
quality perspective, what are you finding you're measuring? What are the kind of parameters that are most useful? And then from an edge case perspective, what are you finding yourself monitoring? And has
sure.
that presented some challenges? Because of it, I think we all understand that we can reliably measure CO2 these days. We temperature and humidity is pretty much bang on, as long as that they're located properly. Particulate matter is pretty good. Certainly in recent years, within the last half decade, there's some really good products delivering reliable particulate sensing as much as we can.
Right.
So I'm guessing that's the typical, and TVOCs give you some indication of chemicals, but not precise.
Right.
So there's a core of a product there, I guess, in those types of monitoring. Would that be fair to
Yeah.
say?
So
Yeah.
the six parameters that you're talking about, would account for at least 85% of all our marketing needs, monitoring needs. The
Sure.
rest 15% might need ozone, might need nitrogen oxide, different other formaldehydes, etc. Right, but primarily
Yeah.
80-85% are the 6 parameters which are standard for well building guidelines and USGDC
Yeah.
guidelines as well.
And for those, so I think, and I think particularly listeners of this show, we've talked quite a lot about the difference between low cost sensors and near reference grade sensors and the capabilities of this technology. I think there's a good understanding at this stage that the deployment of little white boxes that are measuring those fundamentals are pretty good.
Right.
But I guess, like, even at that fundamental level, like you say, because you've got to be so careful about, I imagine, drift and accuracy over time with these devices. If you develop some fairly solid internal processes for calibration and continued monitoring of those devices, that what you're seeing in year 4 is relatively similar to what you're seeing in year 1 of a device, because you don't want to drift. A drift of 10 or 15% on a sensor, you
Oh
don't
no,
want to drift of 10 or 15%
no,
on
no,
a
no.
HVAC
It's
system. That could be catastrophic from a
absolutely, absolutely.
profitability perspective. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it's also important that uh, all the data that we are generating is, of course, it needs to be accurate. But having a third party come in and do the tests for us and give us a report on this annually adds to the confidence that clients also like, the different certification agencies also like. So this is a general practice that we keep at Aico. There'll be a third party lab that will come in and visit all our sites and give a third party certification on that, on the accuracy of our readings. So that helps us as well.
That's really interesting you're doing that. Yeah, okay. That's worth unpacking a little bit, actually, because I think that's great. I was going to ask you, have you found that happening? But the fact that you're actually fundamentally doing that as part of the service, what are those organizations coming in and measuring? Is it just, are they measuring the same things that the devices are measuring and checking that you're within a tolerance? Or are they coming in and doing broader sweep analysis of things like the top 10 VOCs or something like that? Are they doing some broader work, or are you just focusing on, are we getting reliable data out of these products still?
Sure. They do both depending on what the client wants, right? But
Okay.
again, this is also a line item in the entire in the contract, right? So it also depends on what our how um, detailed the client is on this. It matters on that as well, right? For example, there's no way to measure viruses or different pathogens in the air through the kind of sensing technologies that we use at the moment, IoT systems rely on, right? So for those things which we can't measure, we still need that measurement. A third party lab can provide for that. So there are filtration systems, very advanced oxidization systems that we use for control of live organic matter in air conditioning system and the spaces that we leak. So for that we need their data generation report. And for everything else that we measure, having another third party to come and give us the accuracy reports, etc., helps us in furthering our efforts in accuracy of data and our models. And of course, the client is also satisfied with that kind of open transparency on that.
So that if somebody comes in and does a third party sweep of areas that you've got, say, low cost sensors in, can you feed that information in and adjust calibrations then as a result? So if you're seeing a sensor is out for some reason, you can readjust what you're doing.
We will,
Because
yeah.
because we're noticing, particularly in things like Well and Reset and others, that certainly Well has dropped the requirement for an annual test, that they're now starting to rely on the calibration, and I say, for those not looking at the video, quote unquote calibration of low cost sensors, because we know practically it's very difficult to calibrate low cost sensors often in the field. So it's interesting for a company that actually has to stand over outcomes here, that you're still leaning on an annual check of some description to keep some honesty in the equation, that
So,
that
so
there's
Simon,
some benefit there.
these labs usually take a week to give you the results, right? And if we see some of the devices are off by whatever points, we can calibrate them on the air. So we have OTA,
Yeah.
and we can calibrate the devices without having to bring those devices back to our factories. We can, wherever they're installed, they can be installed there, and we'll just recalibrate them and reboot it. It will restart and start giving the right data.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think time will tell. I mean, the challenge, and I guess you've seen this as well because you've been doing this over the last 5 years or so. I can't remember what you said, 9 years. I think you were been
It's
looking at
eight
this.
years now. 8 years.
Yeah, the development of the technology is so fast from a sensing perspective that it's very difficult. What we say now almost certainly isn't going to be true in 5 years' time. So I
Certainly.
think time will tell with these IoT devices, but we're certainly at the point where our confidence level in some of the more basic parameters is at a point now that we trust them a lot more than we did 5 years ago. I mean, some of the readings we were getting
Absolutely.
on PM
Yeah.
readings 5 years ago was all over the place, right?
Right.
Um, but I think it will be interesting to look back in 5 years' time and say, was it false confidence or not? Us relying on these low cost sensors on their own to be reliable. And for an organization like yours that's got so much riding at stake on the accuracy of those devices, that you're making the choice to say, look, you know what? It's worth us while to having that sanity check annually still to keep an eye on this. It may well be in 5 years' time you look back and go, look, they're so closely aligned that we can make these
Yeah.
adjustments over the air without that annual check.
Right.
But at the moment, your gut is it that we still need that? You still want that process anyway in place
Right,
to get
Simon.
it checked.
I think in the future, um, accuracy will not be a concern with these low cost sensors at some point in time, say 7, 8 years or probably a decade later. And thankfully, they'll become so affordable and smaller, and you'll probably have all your IoT devices which will be battery backed, so you'll never have to connect them with a cable anywhere. So I think scaling them in the future is going to be far more easier than what we're doing right now. Our devices are relatively still clunkier, larger than what I anticipate they can be. Uh, like we are probably in the regular telephone era where we have landlines. And so that's sort of an era on air quality monitoring where we will eventually achieve the iPhone era of air quality monitoring soon, where we'll have fairly small devices, all battery backed, very accurate, can recalibrate themselves, etc., etc. I think we're moving towards that as an industry.
Yeah, really interesting. And the other part of that monitoring the environment part, as you said, was outdoor monitoring, but also pressure monitoring. So you were looking at pressure differences either sides of filters to understand their performance over time, which I think most people can understand. Like some devices will have that, some HVAC equipment will have that anyway, but I'm guessing a lot of spaces you go into may not have that. But you're also talking about positively pressurizing buildings as well and understanding the pressure performance of spaces. Are you deploying pressure sensors from that perspective as well to understand how the building is performing from a pressure perspective?
From the last 3, 4 years, most of the air quality monitors that we manufacture come in with a pressure sensor. So it's
Okay.
important to also measure pressure in real time because that is probably the most important thing when it comes to indoor air purification and indoor quality maintenance, which frankly most of the people miss. Because for an air filter manufacturer or an air quality monitor manufacturer, these things are often a miss and it doesn't really matter. And most of the facility managers, it's tough for them to account for this data and put that into the larger scheme of things when you're looking at air quality and understand that because of lack of fresh air, we had a negatively pressurized buildings, and there was ingress of dust lead of full air in from everywhere we could possibly have in the building, and hence the air quality was bad. it makes so much sense when I say that in a sentence, but it's usually the data is broken and all these data are in silos. So it's tough to bring them together and analyze them together.
Yeah, and that's a big part of what you're doing, I guess, and a big part of your USP is your amalgamation of this data, understanding what you want as an outcome and having to stand over it. You're developing in-house algorithms and analytics to understand building performance. And I think most people understand that there's been several companies for years that have done HVAC optimizing indoor air quality monitoring type approaches. But this is where you physically have to stand over outcomes. You're out. You've had to develop. I'm imagining some
Absolutely, Simon.
interesting
So if you have
algorithms. Yeah,
ingress of air, you have polluted air, plus you have way more warmer air coming in from outside from an India perspective. And so that's bad for your air purification of the service building, business, and also very bad for your energy efficiency as a service. Because if you have warm air coming in from all the corners of the building, there's no way you can maintain the air conditioning system with that kind of energy efficiency that you initially imagined it to be. So again, you will
yeah.
not break even as quickly as you wanted to.
So you're also a software and data analytics business as well. I guess it's not just sensors and hardware and filters. You're having to provide platforms and desktop dashboards and, like you say, screens in foyers and things like this for people. So that's a big part of your business, I guess, the analytics side of this and improving your product over time through data.
Absolutely, Simon. So our platform is probably the most important part of the business. All the 7 IPs that I probably touched upon earlier are a part of the platform, right? So that is the most fundamental, most important part of our business, where and how we analyze data, what amount of data we analyze, what we filter out, and because all the outcomes work in conjunction to what AI asks the building to. So this system basically sits over the existing building management system and can control the HVAC remotely in real time without anyone having to do whatever. So
Okay.
this AI is
And
very important.
do you have you got some kind of BMS engineers within the business as well that are integrating your systems into existing systems? Is that quite a large part of the process?
Absolutely, because taking the data from the building, sending it to a cloud, and doing all the computing there, and then again telling the building what to do um, uh, in a completely wireless setup, it's a challenge because every building will have different issues, especially when we're talking about taking data from archaic BMSs that were installed 20 years back, and to be able to communicate, transfer that data on the cloud, do all the things that we do, and then giving the input back what needs to be done right now. It is a bit of a challenge, but then again, we've been able to do all of this, and we are able to scale this because it is a 0-person business. You don't need a human in this anywhere. It's completely
Yeah.
automated. So once you integrate your systems and data pipeline to the existing building management system, you're done. You're ready to launch.
And my apologies for jumping around on you, Ayush, but I meant to ask you earlier about the indoor air quality monitoring. We were talking about the fundamental monitoring, but where you've moved into the edge case stuff, so starting to measure NO2 or sulfur dioxide or ozones, these kind of things, although it's possible to measure them, monitor them with monitors, have you been able to find practical use for that data in the provision of air quality as a service? Because I think that would be really interesting for people. I think there's an awareness now that these multi-sensor devices are starting to appear that can measure things like formaldehyde and ozone and NO2 and CO and all sorts of things. But data without purpose is just noise, and for you, no more so than anybody else. So, like, if you've got something, you need to be able to do something with it. Have you found that's the case? Like, have you been able to look at things like ozone and
Yeah.
actually make an adjustment that makes a difference, or
So
NO2
Simon,
or something like
we
that?
we cannot spend any money on any hardware to generate data and not use that data for anything, right? It's just not possible because as a service, I better use everything that I install and make the most of it, right? So I'll give you some examples. In NCR, sorry, in the National Capital Region, we manage certain large spaces of the news broadcasters. So these guys have very expensive equipment, right, from cameras and different electronic equipments, and the levels of SO2 and NO2 are fairly high in that region. So, but we did not know this. But what was happening is their PCBs and their electronics were getting short. They were getting certain issues with them because of the presence of these gases, right? These create issues with electrical systems. And because that was happening, we realized, and the client was ready to invest because we're talking about multi-million-dollar equipment, right? So installing some air quality monitoring, which will be probably worth a few $100s, and probably again a few $100s on air purification, is nothing compared to the cost of the electrical systems that we're talking about, right? And we did that test, and we got to know about the parameters in real time, and then again took care by installing certain filters in the HVAC system, which were able to solve for that problem. Apart from this, another case that we've seen our systems work very, very well, there's a product called NanoClair. This is a titanium dioxide based metal filter which has a silver nano particle based chemical which is sprayed on the aluminum metal. When air passes through it, anything which is organic in nature, be it a formaldehyde, toluene, or benzene, or even some organic matters, can be treated by these filters. And the best part is, Simon, that these filters have almost no air pressure, or there's no extra added air pressure, right? So we did this test in one of the buildings where the formaldehyde levels were extremely high, and we were able to showcase to the end client that if you cannot change, so there's a hotel chain which just cannot change the certain scents that they use in their spaces, right? Certain perfumes, room fresheners that they use, they just cannot change globally, unfortunately, where they're stuck right now. So they needed certain purification levels on organic compounds, so we were able to do that for them as well.
Really interesting. And I mean, it sounds absolutely fascinating. The a big part of this, and you did mention it earlier on, is that you're also a filter company as well. So you have your own range of filters that you manufacture. So that must be a help that you can design and install filters to your specific requirements to get the outcomes that you want. And again,
Yes.
you have to stand over the quality of that product, because if you get that wrong, you're going to be you're going to see the pressure drop, or they're not going to be as effective as they get. So you're looking at you're looking at the filtration of it, you're looking at the fit of them, everything has to work, I guess.
Absolutely. And the installation as well, right? So supply, installation, testing, and commissioning. Everything is our responsibility end to end. If we screw up in any of these activities, I burn my fingers in that time. So I'll lose a lot of money. So it's important to follow the process properly.
Yeah. And have you found yourself at any point getting involved in the capital equipment of these buildings as well, having to replace HVAC units on rooftops and things like that? Or do you generally, is that, look, come back to us when all that's done and then we'll work with you? Is there any element of this that you start replacing equipment in buildings as a result of what you're delivering?
Simon, probably someday in the future when we scale, when we can risk that kind of capital. But at the moment, we request the client to take care of it themselves and get back to us whenever they're ready with it.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, and I can understand why. I mean, that's a big hole to, as I imagine, as interesting as it is, it's a big spend, therefore, but potential revenue, but it's a whole other industry. You've got to be good at what you're doing.
Absolutely, Simon. And I really don't want to bet on someone else's hardware, to be honest. Unless and until I manufacture it, I understand the quality, I can control it. I'd rather stay away. I would not bet on anyone else. That's what we do.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, how did you find yourself doing this, Ayush? What was your story? because you've ended up in a very particular place. That I guess you found yourself here for one reason or another.
Yeah, so it's very strange. When all of this was happening, I never ever thought that I'll build a company in this space. Um, so I'll tell you what happened. Um, so my family is from central India, where from a place which is fairly green, very very green, very spaced out apartments, places, etc. Right. So environmentally very very comparatively compared to most of the places in the country, quite pristine. My father moved to Delhi in November 2017, if I'm not wrong, and he was hospitalized because you might know about the Indian festival called Diwali, where we burst a lot of crackers, unfortunately, and at the same time you have stubble burning in the north part of the country around Delhi. So the air quality in November and December was extremely bad in the national capital, unfortunately. And my father got so sick, he got admitted in the hospital. And when I flew to Delhi from Bangalore to meet the doctor and see my father, I was told that it was happening because of PM 2.5. And Simon, I had no idea what PM 2.5 is. And the doctor was super busy. I asked him, what is PM 2.5? He was like, hey man, you have a smartphone, just Google it. Figure out what you need to do. So I Googled and I realized that air purifiers can solve for it. But if you look at most of the larger OEMs, air purifiers, they're fairly expensive. So I realized that's a problem, and this is something which is affecting everyone. So we wanted to start. So basically, I wanted to start the company in a space which is honest. We are very clear and transparent about what we're doing, and we should deliver on that promise. So hence, having transparency, being completely accountable for what you're doing was very very important. Because if I buy a fairly expensive air purifier, and because my home has multiple spaces where outside air comes in, the air purifier is not able to maintain the air quality. The air purifier company is not going to return the money, and I would never be able to understand where the leakages are coming from, right? Hence I thought that as a service will make more sense than selling a hardware, because you might not genuinely solve the problem for the end client by selling a hardware. But if you create a solution around it, that's where we can really make things change at scale. So that's what we've been doing.
And I think that's a wonderful story of the DNA of the business. But so you start with that seed, but you've got to get yourself to a place where you've built the component parts necessary to deliver an as a service model. Because often as a service models come from manufacturers of a product that's usually quite expensive and complex, and they realize that if they're the best in class at doing that, that there's some deeper relationship to be gained by providing this product as a service model. They have, they've got decades of experience. The Rolls-Royce is a good example of that.
Right.
Decades of experience, of confidence in being a market leading product, and saying,
Right.
well, actually, rather than getting somebody to outlay hundreds of thousands, millions of pounds, euros, whatever in product, we can provide this in an as a service model. But you've kind of come at it from the ground up, where you say, look, I think we can deliver an outcome. I've now got to build the components to deliver that. So you've had to start developing sensors, filters, data analytics and software management, and the list goes on. That's quite a different proposition, a different angle to come at it from. That's taken some time, I guess, to do,
Absolutely,
to go,
Simon.
right,
So
okay, if I'm going to measure air quality, how do I do it? Like, what's the way to do this? If I'm going to do data analytics, what kind of people do I need to do data analytics for me? Like, it's a totally different proposition.
absolutely, Simon. Absolutely. I was clearly oversimplifying it, but to be honest, we made almost zero revenue in the first 2.5 years. It was all R&D, R&D, and R&D. Before Clairco, I've been part of some fairly decent hardware companies that scaled and got acquired, etc., etc. So I've been a startup founder for a while. So, and that too from an IoT perspective, I've worked with a company which made certain hardware that generated a lot of telematics data from an automotive perspective. So we sold it to an insurance company. So I was someone who spent time on hardware, so I knew a few folks who could help me out with that, and also the dashboard data point. Where I struggled the most, Simon, was on the air filtration side. This was something I had zero background in. I am not from the HVAC space, do not understand computational fluid dynamics, don't understand how air purification in general works. So I spent insane amount of time on understanding those technologies, and in fact, we acquired one of the patents. The NanoClair product that I was explaining right now is a patent that we did not make from scratch. The technology was bought off from someone else.
Yeah, interesting. So now you find yourself in a position of profitability. You're scaling. You mentioned to me the last time we spoke how many square feet of buildings you're already managing. It's quite impressive. Remind listeners again, where are you at as a business now from a
So
scale
we are at
perspective?
around 23 million square feet now. Hopefully we'll reach around 90 million square feet by the end of the financial year, March 26 for us in India. We'll have some presence in the Middle East and of course all across India.
And is that your focus at the moment, the Indian market and the Middle East? Is that where the
Yes,
focus is going to be? Yeah.
yes, but we're actively looking for partners for international growth. It's our market is very tough to penetrate unless you know people there and have the kind of relationships that are required for these things. So we're also, of course, looking for partners globally, because the technology is ready. It can be scaled provided we have the right people in each geography.
Yeah, so again, there's these kind of these baselines that you need scale in buildings. Certainly, at the moment, is there a kind of a scale of the quality of outdoor? I mean, I guess it makes a more of a business case the poorer the outdoor air quality. Like, are you able? If you are you? Is there a kind of a what's the best way to put this? Have you been selling your product into environments where air quality is reasonable? And are you able to make a business case in those types of environments? That would
So
be interesting to understand where those kind of flaws are. Like, is there a point at which you go, look, to be honest, it's pretty good outdoors, so like just open the window, you'll be fine. But there must be a point at which that kind of conversation comes into play where you just start saying, look, just bring a load of outdoor air in. Your building's in a great place.
yeah.
Um, yeah.
So Simon, I'll tell you something very interesting. Okay. So how I look at it is, number one, most of our clients want to have air purification, not only from because they want to benefit from the better air quality from wellness standpoint, but it's essentially to get those certifications, or because there's a mandate from certain company that is asking them to do this, right? So it's a compliance, mostly rather than from the goodness of their hearts. Number one, unfortunately. So these companies need some sort of documentation data to back that. Number one. Secondly, on a lighter note, if a company can maintain air quality in New Delhi across the year and has been able to do that for the last 5, 6 years, I think that company can maintain air quality anywhere in the world. So yeah, I can proudly say that. And so yeah, so we are happy to work anywhere. And even in the Middle East, the air quality is not that good. But and we met a lot of clients who are like, we don't need this. Our air quality is pretty decent. But then, of course, when we start measuring the data, it tells you the truth. The problem is because we don't have enough data in most of the buildings, people think that the air quality is great, but it's usually not.
Yeah, and the truth is, in a lot of spaces, a lot of the pollution is generated internally anyway. So it doesn't matter where your building is
Absolutely.
in the world. You can have poor air quality outcomes anywhere. Um,
100%.
and and as you say, from a compliance perspective, a lot of organisations may be looking down the barrel of something like LEED or WELL or something that they want to try and achieve. but just don't want the hassle and complexity of doing it themselves. So an as a service model is a model that steps in for you and says, look, in a year and a half time, you could be hitting these numbers. We take care of all of that for you. Um, that's what the as a service model delivers. So as a, even if they are doing it for the right reasons, it may just be that it just seems too complex. So you have an organization that deals with it end to end for you, which is really interesting.
So, I mean, it really is quite complex, like I mentioned, there can be leakages. You have to maintain a certain steady flow of fresh air consistently. You need to predict when the air filter needs to be changed. If you change the filter too late, your HVAC energy bills will increase. If you change the filter too early, you're wasting your money. So it's pretty tricky, right? And there's so many things that we need to do. And again, we've been doing this for the last couple of years at scale in locations where quality is horrible, and we've been able to sort this out. So I could very proudly and confidently say that we are experts at it, and we understand this probably better than most of the building managers themselves, because they have 10,000 other things to do. We only have one thing to do, that is maintain indoor air quality, and then we do it faster than most people.
So going back to kind of bring this conversation full circle, because there is at the moment a floor at which, or an entry point at which this makes sense, which means for the vast majority of the built environment, this isn't an option yet. But to me, clearly there's some lessons to be learnt here. If you were to give your top 3 lessons that as a service model has taught you as a business in actually achieving good outcomes for companies that aren't going to go down the as a service model route, smaller office spaces, places that might not have the infrastructure, what should they concentrate on? For people that actually want to get a good outcome, what are the top 3 things from an as a service perspective that they could take away from this conversation and apply themselves, do you think?
Sure. So there are 3 basics to air quality maintenance indoor. Number 1, have enough data on indoor air quality. And if you can install an air quality monitor outdoor, that's a massive plus. Number 2, select the right air filter. A HEPA filter will not solve your problem in an older air conditioning system. It will just not allow the air to pass through, right? So you need an air conditioning system, an air filter that can sit on your existing air conditioning system without massive capex costs, right? Without having to change the motor, pulley, the fan assembly, etc. on your air conditioning system. Selecting the air filter can be tricky. So figure out an air filter which can have a higher NERV rating, which has a lower IPD, that is lower initial pressure drop. So selecting the right filter is second most important part. And third, extremely important, is having some sort of a ventilation system that either brings in fresh air based on demand, or consistently brings in certain level of fresh air. So all these 3 things are extremely important for this.
I think that's really interesting. And I think it just goes to show that data is key. You can't manage what you don't measure. So if you don't know what's going on in your building, then you're never going to know where you're starting from and where you're going to. And I think that's a lesson everybody can take away. And this isn't a big spend for it. Even small organizations can deploy very low cost monitors that will give them a good sense of what's going on in their space. And that you don't need to be a PhD to interpret some of this data. It will tell you some of the stuff can be pretty obvious where you're going wrong, but do engage with experts, where you can. And then just basic fundamentals, decent engineering controls. Like you say, if you've got filters, make sure they're the right ones and they're serviced and maintained and delivering what they need to. And that you've got the ability to bring outdoor air in as part of that process and dilute the space from the pollutants that filters aren't necessarily going to be able to manage. Isn't it funny how it always comes back to fundamentals, Aayush, often? And it's just so even something as advanced like an as a service model still has to lean on basic principles to get this right.
always, and getting the basics right is the tough part.
Yeah,
So yeah.
absolutely. Ayush, listen, thanks a million for spending the time with me today. It's been brilliant talking to you. I found personally the conversation absolutely fascinating. I wish you all the luck as a business. The more square meterage of businesses that are moving towards air quality as service, I think the more we'll learn. If I will include your company details and things in the show notes for people who want to check you out and to get in contact with you if they want to learn any more. Ayush, thanks a million for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Simon. This was fun. Thank you so much for having me here. Means a lot.
Thanks for listening. Before you go, can I ask a favour? If you enjoyed the podcast and know somebody else who might be interested, do spread the word and let's keep building this community. This podcast was brought to you in partnership with Aereco, Aico, Ultra Protect, InBiot, and 21 Degrees, all great companies who share the vision of the podcast and aren't here by accident. Your support of them helps them support this show. Do check them out in the links and in the show notes and at airqualitymatters.net. And don't forget to check out the YouTube channel by the same name with plenty more content due to come on that channel. Thanks very much. See you next week.